The air was heavy that morning, carrying the smell of wet grass after a night of light rain. Clouds moved slowly across the sky, dimming the sunlight and giving the cemetery a gray and quiet mood. Among the rows of stones, a tall man in a dark coat walked slowly. His name was David, a man known in the city for his great wealth and power. Many called him a billionaire, but he felt more like a broken soul than a man of riches. David's polished shoes touched the damp ground, yet each step felt heavier than the last. He had walked this same path many times, and every visit seemed harder than the one before. The cemetery was a place where ordinary people came with flowers, tears, and prayers. For him, it was a place where his heart was buried with someone he could never bring back. He reached a grave at the far corner, away from the crowded path. It was marked with a simple stone, not grand or shining, but quietly respectful. On it were engraved the words, "Beloved son, rest in peace." David bent down, his knees pressing against the cold earth, and laid a bouquet of white lilies on the stone. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the flowers, brushing away the leaves that had fallen during the night. A deep sigh escaped his chest. The world knew him as a man who owned buildings, companies, and expensive cars. They saw the sharp suits, the glass offices, and the flashing lights of his name in business magazines. But here, kneeling before his son's grave, he was only a father who had lost his child. No amount of money could rebuild what he had lost. For a long time, David stayed silent. His eyes traced the name on the stone again and again, as if by looking long enough, he could bring his son back. He whispered soft words, a mix of apology and longing, though no one else could hear them. His voice cracked, and for a moment, the mask he wore in front of the world slipped away. As the wind blew across the field, David's eyes moved slightly. Not far from where he sat, he noticed someone else. A woman, dressed in a simple black dress, was kneeling at another grave. Her back was straight, but her shoulders shook slightly, giving away the tears she was trying to hide. Her skin was brown, her face lined with sadness, though she was not old. She looked like someone who carried the weight of life's struggles on her thin frame. Beside her stood a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. He clutched her hand tightly, his wide eyes watching her with quiet worry. The boy wore a faded shirt and trousers, clothes that seemed a little too big for him. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly restless, but he did not let go of his mother's hand. David could not look away. In all his visits, he had seen many people crying at graves. It was not unusual. Yet there was something different about this woman. The way she knelt, the way she held herself together even while breaking inside, drew his attention. And the boy's silence, the way he stood steady beside her, touched something deep in David's heart. He told himself to mind his own sorrow. He came here to be with his son, not to stare at strangers. But his eyes returned to them again and again. The woman brushed at her tears quickly, as if ashamed to show them in front of her child. She whispered something to him, and though David could not hear her words, he saw the boy nod. The child bent down and placed a small flower on the grave, not a bouquet like the ones people usually brought, but just one bright yellow flower, probably picked from somewhere nearby. It was all they had, but the boy laid it with such care that David felt a strange ache inside. Something in him wanted to step closer, to ask who they were mourning, to offer some comfort. But another part of him stopped. He was not good with words of sympathy. He had spent years hiding his own grief, never speaking of it to anyone. What right did he have to step into another person's sorrow? Still, his mind kept circling with questions. Who was the woman? Why did she look so broken yet so strong? What story lay behind her tears? And why, of all people, did he feel drawn to them on this morning, when he usually wished to be alone? The silence stretched. The woman gently pulled her child closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. Her lips moved in a prayer, soft and shaky. The boy closed his eyes, copying her, his small face serious. Watching them, David felt his throat tighten. He had prayed at this grave many times, but never with such simple, pure faith. The clouds above shifted, letting a pale ray of light fall across the cemetery. It touched the graves, the grass, and the faces of the grieving. David lowered his head again, torn between the past that haunted him and the strange presence of the woman and child just steps away. For the first time in many years, he did not feel completely alone. David rose slowly from the ground, brushing the damp soil from his knees. His heart still felt heavy, but his eyes could not help drifting again toward the woman and child. He told himself he should leave, that his visit was over, but something in that quiet scene held him in place. The woman wiped her cheeks quickly, straightening her posture as if she did not want anyone to see her weakness. The boy, still holding her hand, leaned against her side. He looked curious now, his small eyes glancing in David's direction before quickly looking back at his mother. David hesitated. He had always been a man of distance, polite, formal, and careful with his words. He had learned to live behind walls, both in business and in his personal life. But those walls were shaking now, standing in the presence of two strangers who seemed to mirror the loneliness in his heart. Finally, he took a slow step forward. His shoes pressed softly into the wet grass, and the sound of his movement made the woman lift her head. Her eyes, still wet with tears, met his. For a moment, they both froze, two grieving souls caught in the silence of a cemetery. "I am sorry," David said softly, his voice lower than usual. "I did not mean to disturb you." The woman shook her head quickly, pulling her child closer. "No, you are not disturbing us." Her voice was gentle but tired, carrying the weight of many sleepless nights. David nodded, unsure how to continue. He looked at the grave before her, its stone worn and old. A name was carved there, but from where he stood, he could not read it clearly. He noticed, however, how little there was on it, no fresh flowers except the single yellow one the boy had laid down. "Someone you loved?" David asked carefully. The woman's lips trembled, but she nodded. "My husband," she whispered. "He passed away last year." She lowered her head, her hand tightening around the child's shoulder. "He was a kind man. Life is not the same without him." David's chest ached at her words. Loss was a language he understood too well. His own son's absence had left an emptiness that no riches could fill. For a moment, he was unsure what to say, so he let silence sit between them. The little boy suddenly looked up at him. His eyes were wide and curious, full of innocence, yet his face carried a seriousness not common in children his age. "Mister," the boy said quietly, "why are you here?" The question startled David. Few dared to ask him personal things, and even fewer did so with such honesty. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing that perhaps this was the first time in years someone had looked directly at him with such simplicity. "I come to see my son," David finally said, his voice steady but low. He left this world too soon." The boy's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly, as if he understood something far beyond his years. He stepped a little closer, his small hand still clinging to his mother's fingers. The woman looked at David carefully now, her expression changing. At first, she had only seen a stranger, an older man in a fine coat, carrying an air of wealth. But now, she saw the sadness behind his eyes. It was the same sadness she carried inside her own heart. "I am sorry for your loss," she said gently. "It is not easy, losing a child." David swallowed hard. Few people dared to speak so directly to him about his grief. Most avoided the topic, fearing it would hurt him more. But hearing the words spoken with honesty, he felt something loosen inside him, as if the burden was shared, even for a brief moment. "Thank you," he murmured. The boy tugged at his mother's dress. "Mama," he whispered, though his voice was clear enough for David to hear, "can we give the flower to the man's son too?" The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she looked down at her child with surprise. The boy held out his hand, as if ready to pick another small flower from somewhere nearby. His innocence, his kindness, made David's heart tremble. David knelt down slowly, so he was at the boy's height. "That is very kind of you," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "But your flower is for your father. He would be proud." The boy blinked, then smiled faintly. "Papa liked flowers," he said simply. For the first time in months, David felt his lips curve into a faint smile too. It was not forced, not empty, it was real, born from the small kindness of a child who did not even know him. The woman watched this exchange quietly. Something about the man unsettled her. He did not look like an ordinary visitor. His coat, his shoes, even the way he spoke, everything about him whispered wealth. Yet, instead of arrogance, she saw humility in his eyes. She wondered who he really was, and why he seemed drawn to them. The sky above darkened slightly as the clouds thickened again, hinting at more rain. The woman pulled her child closer. "We should go," she said softly, though her eyes lingered on David for a moment longer. David wanted to say something to keep them there, though he did not know why. He only managed a quiet, "Take care of yourself." She gave a small nod, her eyes unreadable, and then turned to walk slowly toward the gate, her child holding her hand tightly. David stood where he was, watching them leave. For reasons he could not explain, he felt as if a thread had been tied between their grief and his own. Something told him this was not the last time their paths would cross. And deep inside, he knew this encounter was the beginning of something he never expected. The next day, David sat by the wide glass window of his office, staring out at the city skyline. Tall buildings stood like giants, cars moved like streams of light, and people rushed about their daily lives. It was the empire he had built with his own hands, yet it all felt strangely empty. His assistant had left papers on his desk that required signatures, but he had not touched them. Instead, his mind kept wandering back to the cemetery. The image of the woman in black and her quiet child replayed again and again. He could not shake the sound of the boy's voice, so small yet filled with kindness. And the woman's eyes, tired but strong, remained etched in his memory. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. It puzzled him. He had met hundreds of people over the years, partners, workers, even strangers who tried to win his attention. None of them had ever stayed in his thoughts this way. Why did a single mother and her son, whom he barely knew, stir something in him? Later that evening, as the sun set, he returned once more to the cemetery. He told himself it was only to visit his son, but deep down he knew there was another reason. His heart carried a hope he could not explain, a hope that perhaps he would see them again. The grounds were quiet when he arrived. A few people were leaving, their footsteps fading away. David walked to his son's grave and placed fresh flowers again. His fingers brushed the stone gently, and he whispered a few words, promising never to forget. Yet his eyes, against his own will, searched the distance. Then he saw them. The woman was there again, kneeling at the same grave as before. The boy sat cross-legged on the grass beside her, drawing little shapes in the dirt with a small stick. They looked poor, but there was a dignity about them, a quiet grace in the way they carried themselves. This time, David did not hesitate. He walked closer, his step slow but steady. The woman looked up when she noticed him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "Yes," David answered, stopping a few steps away. "I did not expect to see you again so soon." The boy jumped up, his face brightening with recognition. "It's the man from yesterday," he said, tugging his mother's hand. David knelt slightly to greet him. "And it is the kind boy from yesterday," he replied, his lips curving into the faintest smile. The woman gave a small nod, though her expression was guarded. "We come here often," she explained. "It is the only place my son feels close to his father." David's eyes softened. "I understand. I come here for the same reason." For a while, silence stretched between them. The boy began to hum softly, distracted with his little game in the dirt, while the adult stood in the heavy stillness of memory. David finally spoke. "May I ask, what was your husband's name?" Her eyes lowered to the grave, and her lips trembled before she answered. "His name was Samuel. He worked hard every day to give us a simple life. He was a driver, kind and patient. One night he met with an accident while on duty, and he never came home." Her voice broke at the end, though she tried to hold it together. David felt his throat tighten. "I am sorry," he whispered. "The world is cruel to take away good people so soon." She nodded faintly, her hands clenching together. "Since then, it has just been me and my son." She glanced at the boy, who was now smiling at something he had drawn in the dirt. "He is my strength, but life has been very hard." David studied her quietly. Her clothes were plain, her shoes worn, yet she carried herself with pride. There was no begging in her voice, no complaint, only quiet endurance. The boy suddenly ran up to David, holding out his little drawing on the stick. "Look, mister. It's a house," he said proudly. David bent down to see. The drawing was rough and uneven, but the boy's eyes sparkled with joy. "It's wonderful," David said warmly. "Is this where you want to live one day?" The child nodded eagerly. "Yes. With Mama. A small house with flowers outside." The woman's eyes filled with tears at her son's words, though she quickly turned away so David would not see. But he noticed. He always noticed. Something stirred deep inside him, a feeling he had not known in years, a longing to protect, to give, to care. It startled him, yet it also felt right. As the evening grew darker, the woman stood. "We should go," she said, holding her son's hand. David hesitated, then asked softly, "May I know your name?" She paused for a moment before answering. "My name is Maria. And this is my son, Daniel." David repeated the names quietly, as if memorizing them. "Maria. Daniel. Thank you, for speaking with me." Maria gave a small nod, and together they began walking toward the gate. Daniel waved back at David with his small hand, his smile bright against the fading light. David stood alone once more, but this time his heart did not feel as heavy. The names, the faces, the small kindness of a child, they echoed in his thoughts long after they were gone. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. The next few days passed slowly for David. Work filled his hours, but his mind often drifted away. Papers piled on his desk, phone calls demanded his attention, and meetings filled his calendar. Yet in the middle of every busy moment, he found himself thinking of Maria and her little boy. Their names echoed in his heart, bringing a strange warmth that pushed through the loneliness he had lived with for so long. On the fourth evening, David could not resist returning to the cemetery once more. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the smell of fresh earth and fading flowers. When he arrived at his son's grave, his eyes immediately searched for them. At first, he feared they would not come. But then, across the field, he saw Maria and Daniel walking slowly toward Samuel's grave. The boy skipped a little, his energy bright against the sadness of the place. Maria walked calmly, her black dress swaying with each step. David felt an unexplainable relief. He waited until they settled before walking over. Daniel spotted him first and waved cheerfully. "Mister," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet ground. Maria looked up too, surprise in her eyes, but this time she did not seem as guarded as before. "You are here again," she said softly. David smiled faintly. "Yes. I come often." Daniel ran toward him, his small hand tugging at David's sleeve. "Come sit with us," the boy said with excitement. David looked at Maria, waiting for her reaction. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. And so, for the first time, David sat with them at Samuel's grave. The three of them sat in silence at first. Maria placed a small bunch of wildflowers on the stone, while Daniel traced little patterns on the ground. David rested his hands on his knees, looking between the grave before them and the faces of the living beside him. "Do you live far from here?" David asked gently. Maria shook her head. "No. Just a short walk from the cemetery. We rent a small room nearby." Her answer stirred something in him. A billionaire living in a mansion was sitting beside a woman and child who could barely afford a small room. The distance between their worlds was vast, yet their grief had brought them side by side. "And Daniel?" David asked, glancing at the boy. "Does he go to school?" Maria's lips tightened. "Not now. I am trying, but things are difficult. He learns from me at home." Daniel looked up proudly. "Mama teaches me numbers and stories." David smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "That is wonderful. You must be a good student." The child nodded eagerly, his eyes shining. "I want to be smart like Papa was. He always said learning makes you strong." Maria turned her face away, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. David noticed, but he said nothing. Instead, he let the silence speak for them all. As the sky darkened, Maria finally stood. "We should go before it gets too late," she said, reaching for Daniel's hand. David hesitated, then asked, "May I walk with you?" She looked at him carefully, as though measuring the man before her. Finally, she nodded. "If you wish." And so, the three of them walked together down the narrow path leading out of the cemetery. Daniel skipped ahead a few steps, then ran back to hold his mother's hand again. His laughter filled the air, breaking the heaviness of the evening. When they reached the street, David noticed the small neighborhood Maria led them into. The houses were old, paint peeling, and the roads cracked. Children played barefoot in the dust, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from nearby stalls. Maria stopped at a narrow building with broken steps leading up to the door. "This is where we stay," she said quietly. David looked at the small building, his heart tightening. He had spent his life in luxury, yet here was a family living with so little. He glanced at Maria, who stood tall despite the weariness in her eyes. She did not complain, did not ask for anything. Daniel tugged at his mother's hand. "Mama, can the mister come inside?" Maria shook her head gently. "Not today, Daniel. It is late. Let him go home." The boy looked a little disappointed but then smiled at David. "Come again tomorrow," he said brightly. David chuckled softly. "Perhaps I will." Maria gave David a small nod, her eyes softer than before. "Good night, Mr. David," she said. He stood there for a moment, watching as they disappeared into the dim hallway of the building. For the first time in years, his heart did not feel entirely empty when he walked back to his car. That night, as he sat alone in his large, silent home, David thought about them again and again. The small room they lived in, the boy's innocent smile, Maria's quiet strength, it all echoed inside him. He realized then that his life, filled with wealth and emptiness, was slowly being touched by something he had not expected, the warmth of a new connection. And though he could not explain it, he knew deep down that meeting Maria and Daniel was not an accident. It was the beginning of something that would change him forever. The morning sun shone brightly on the city, yet David's mansion felt colder than ever. He sat at the long dining table, a meal spread out before him: fruit, eggs, bread, and coffee. But he ate none of it. The silence of the house pressed on him. Every wall, every piece of polished furniture, reminded him of how alone he truly was. His mind kept wandering back to the narrow street where Maria and Daniel lived. He could still picture the broken steps, the dim hallway, and the way the boy had waved at him with so much joy. The memory pulled at him, stronger than the taste of any breakfast or the numbers in any business report. By afternoon, David made a decision. He told his driver to take him to the small market near Maria's neighborhood. For once, he left behind the image of the cold billionaire and dressed in a plain shirt and trousers. He did not want to stand out. He wanted to walk among ordinary people, just as Maria did every day. The market was crowded with noise and life. Stalls lined the street, selling fruits, vegetables, bread, and second-hand clothes. Children ran between their mothers, carrying baskets. The smell of spices and cooked food filled the air. David felt out of place at first, but then he saw Maria. She stood near a stall, choosing a few potatoes and a small bundle of green vegetables. Daniel was with her, holding a paper bag with care. They looked simple, ordinary, yet beautiful in a way David could not explain. Maria noticed him after a moment. Surprise flickered in her eyes. "Mr. David," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" David smiled faintly. "I wanted to see how the world looks from here," he replied. Daniel grinned widely, running up to him. "Mister, you came," he said happily. David knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "I promised, didn't I?" Maria shook her head, though her lips curved into the smallest smile. "This place is not for men like you," she said gently. "You belong to big offices and tall buildings, not these broken streets." David looked around at the busy stalls and then back at her. "Maybe this is exactly where I need to be." Maria's expression softened, but she said no more. She returned to the stall, counting the coins in her hand. David noticed how carefully she chose the vegetables, making sure not to spend more than what little she carried. His chest ached at the sight. Without saying anything, he stepped forward and handed money to the shopkeeper. "Add some apples for the boy," he said. Maria froze. "No," she whispered quickly, pulling back his hand. "Please, Mr. David. We cannot take your money." David looked at her steadily. "It is not charity. It is a gift, from one grieving soul to another." Her lips pressed tightly together. For a moment, she looked as if she would refuse again, but then she saw Daniel's eager eyes fixed on the apples. Finally, she nodded, though her voice was low. "Thank you." The shopkeeper wrapped the apples and handed them to Daniel, who hugged them against his chest with delight. "Mama, look. Real apples." Maria blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She turned away quickly, pretending to arrange the vegetables in her bag. David noticed, but he said nothing. They walked together through the market. Daniel skipped between them, holding tightly to his mother's hand with one side and carrying the apples with the other. He talked non-stop, telling David about his favorite games, how his father used to lift him high, and how Mama sang him songs at night. David listened with patience, his heart warming at the boy's simple joy. Each word felt like a thread weaving him closer to them. When they reached the corner of the street, Maria stopped. "This is where we must part," she said softly. "Our home is just ahead." David nodded slowly. He wanted to walk further, to know more about their life, but he respected her boundary. "May I visit again?" he asked gently. Maria looked at him for a long moment. "You may," she said finally. "But not as a rich man. Come as you are now. Plain. Simple." David's chest tightened at her words. "I will," he promised. Daniel waved goodbye eagerly, his small smile bright enough to light the dusty street. "Come tomorrow, mister." David watched them walk away, his heart filled with emotions he had not known in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt a purpose beyond his empty wealth. He felt as if life was quietly giving him another chance through a grieving mother and her innocent child. That night, in his grand but silent mansion, David held onto the memory of Maria's quiet dignity and Daniel's joyful laughter. He realized that no boardroom, no contract, no fortune could ever compare to the warmth of that moment in the crowded market. And deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning of something greater. The following week brought a quiet change in David's life. His days still began with meetings and ended with long drives back to his mansion, but something new filled the spaces in between. Whenever work felt heavy, his thoughts wandered to Maria and Daniel. Whenever loneliness crept in, he remembered the boy's innocent smile and Maria's steady voice. One afternoon, David found himself driving past their neighborhood without even planning it. His car slowed at the sight of the old building where they lived. Children played outside, their laughter echoing in the narrow street. For a moment, David sat inside his car, wondering if it was right for him to appear uninvited. But then, Daniel's familiar voice called out, "Mister." The boy ran up to the car, waving happily. His cheeks were dusty, his shirt a little torn at the corner, but his joy was pure. David stepped out, smiling faintly. "Daniel," he greeted. "How are you today?" "I am good. Mama is inside." "Come, come." The boy grabbed his hand with surprising strength, pulling him toward the building. Maria appeared at the doorway, surprise flashing in her eyes. "Mr. David, you came." David bowed his head slightly. "Forgive me for arriving without notice." I was nearby and thought I might visit. Maria hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. Please, come in. The room was small, just as David imagined. A single bed stood in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a tiny shelf with a few dishes. The walls were cracked, but the space was neat. A faint smell of bread lingered, telling him Maria had been cooking earlier. David sat carefully on one of the chairs while Maria poured him a glass of water. Daniel climbed onto the bed, swinging his legs happily. "This is our home," Maria said softly, her eyes flickering with a hint of embarrassment. "It is not much." David looked around, then shook his head. "It is filled with love. That is more than what many mansions hold." Maria's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes grew distant. "Love is all we have left. And sometimes, even that feels heavy." David wanted to say something comforting, but words seemed weak. Instead, he listened as Daniel began telling stories about his school lessons, about how Mama taught him letters and numbers every evening. When Daniel grew tired and lay down for a nap, Maria finally spoke quietly. "Why do you keep coming back, Mr. David? You are a man with everything. We have nothing to give you." David met her gaze steadily. "Because when I am with you and your son, I feel something I thought I had lost forever." Maria's breath caught. She lowered her eyes, folding her hands in her lap. "You mean your son?" "Yes," David admitted. His voice trembled as he continued. "I had one child. He was my world. I built everything, every business, every success, thinking it was for him. And then, he was gone. No money could save him. Since then, I have lived with an empty heart." Maria's eyes softened, her own pain mirrored in his words. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I know that pain. When Samuel died, I thought my heart would never beat again. But I had Daniel. He pulled me back every day, even when I wanted to give up." Her voice shook, but her strength was clear. David admired her deeply in that moment. She had lost as much as he had, perhaps more, yet she carried herself with dignity. They sat in silence for a while, 2 broken hearts sharing the same room. Then Maria asked quietly, "Do you ever wonder why life takes the ones we love the most?" David nodded slowly. "Every day. But maybe meeting you and Daniel is life's way of reminding me I am not alone." Maria looked at him then, truly looked. In his eyes, she saw not a billionaire, not a powerful man, but a father who had been stripped of his joy. Something inside her softened, though fear still whispered at the edge of her thoughts. The sound of Daniel's gentle breathing filled the room. He had fallen asleep on the bed, his small hand resting near his face. Maria stood and covered him with a thin blanket. David watched quietly, his chest tightening at the sight. For a moment, he wished he could freeze time, just the 3 of them, in that simple room, away from the coldness of the world. As evening approached, David finally stood. "Thank you for letting me into your home," he said gently. "It means more than you know." Maria nodded. "You are welcome here, Mr. David. But please, do not give Daniel hope you cannot keep. He is just a child. He needs stability, not disappointment." Her words struck deep, but David understood. He bowed his head. "I promise, Maria. I will never hurt him." When he left the building and walked back to his car, David felt both heavy and light. Heavy, because he carried the weight of his past. Light, because he had found a connection that made his heart beat again. That night, he stood before his son's grave once more. He placed fresh flowers and whispered softly, "I miss you. But maybe I have found someone who understands." For the first time in years, the loneliness of his mansion did not feel endless. Somewhere in that small room, a boy had called him Mister with joy, and a woman had looked at him with the eyes of someone who truly understood loss. David realized then that he had found not only companionship, but also a fragile, growing hope. The sun was setting in a soft golden glow when David parked his car near Maria's building. It had been weeks since their first meeting at the market, and during that time, he had visited them quietly, sometimes with small gifts, sometimes simply to talk. Slowly, Maria and Daniel had grown comfortable with him, letting him into the small corners of their lives. David stepped out, carrying a small basket filled with bread, fresh fruit, and a few toys for Daniel. The boy ran to him as soon as he spotted him, his laughter ringing through the narrow street. "Mister, you brought something!" Daniel exclaimed, holding the basket carefully. David knelt and smiled at him. "For you and Mama," he said softly. "Just a little something to enjoy together." Maria appeared at the doorway, watching the exchange with quiet surprise. She said nothing, but the soft smile on her lips spoke volumes. She had learned to accept kindness in small doses, but David's patience and gentle heart had begun to earn her trust. They went inside, and Daniel immediately began opening the basket, pulling out fruit and toys with delight. "Look, Mama. Look at this," he said, his eyes wide with joy. Maria shook her head slightly, smiling despite herself. "You spoil him too much," she said softly. David chuckled. "Maybe a little," he admitted. "But he deserves happiness." For a long while, they ate together quietly. The room was small and simple, but for the first time, it felt full of warmth. There were no business calls, no rushing crowds, no lonely silence, just laughter, small talk, and the quiet presence of someone who truly cared. After the meal, Daniel ran to David, tugging at his hand. "Mister, can you tell me a story?" David smiled, settling onto the floor so he was at Daniel's level. "A story?" he asked. "Yes. A story about your son, or my papa, or anything." Daniel's excitement was contagious. David nodded. "All right. I will tell you a story about hope." He began softly, weaving a tale of a father and son separated by fate but brought together by love, kindness, and courage. Daniel listened intently, eyes wide and full of wonder. Maria watched silently, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. When the story ended, Daniel yawned, curling up on his small bed. Maria tucked him in, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Good night, my little one," she whispered. David watched quietly, a lump in his throat. He felt a tenderness he had not known in years, a feeling that was both new and familiar. For so long, he had lived in a world of emptiness and success, but here in this tiny room, he felt the true meaning of family. Maria turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "You have a good heart, Mr. David," she said softly. I am grateful for you. You have given my son, and me, hope we did not know was possible." David lowered his eyes. "I came here because I needed this as much as you did," he admitted. "I thought I was just helping. But you and Daniel, you have helped me more than I can say." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the bond between them unspoken but deeply understood. Then Maria nodded. "Maybe, life can give second chances, even to people who think they have lost everything." David smiled faintly, the weight on his heart lifting slightly for the first time in years. Yes, he agreed. Maybe it can. From that evening on, David continued to visit. He helped in small ways, never imposing, never overwhelming. He repaired a leaky roof, brought school supplies for Daniel, and occasionally stayed to share meals. Maria began to rely on him not as a stranger or a rich man, but as someone who genuinely cared. Daniel, with the innocence of childhood, began calling him Uncle David. The first time he did, David felt a surge of emotion. The word uncle was simple, yet it carried love, trust, and belonging, things he had not felt since losing his own son. One day, as they sat together after school, Daniel asked softly, "Mister, will you always come visit us?" David knelt, looking the boy in the eye. "I promise, Daniel. I will always come." Maria watched the exchange, feeling a quiet happiness bloom in her heart. She realized that the emptiness she had carried for so long was beginning to fade. With David's presence, her life had begun to feel brighter, lighter, full of possibilities she had almost forgotten. That evening, as David walked back to his car, he glanced once more at the building where Maria and Daniel lived. He smiled to himself. The life he had once thought empty, filled with wealth but devoid of love, now carried warmth. A small family, broken in different ways, had come together through grief, kindness, and trust. At his son's grave later that night, David placed fresh flowers. He whispered softly, "I miss you, my boy. But maybe you would be happy knowing someone else is letting me love again." The cemetery was quiet, the stars beginning to shine above. David stood a little taller, his heart lighter. He knew that life, even after the deepest sorrow, could give new beginnings. And sometimes, the people who entered your life unexpectedly became the reason for a brighter tomorrow. David drove home slowly, thinking of Maria and Daniel. He knew that their paths were now forever connected. A billionaire, a grieving mother, and a small boy, each carrying loss, yet together discovering hope, laughter, and love in the simplest moments. And in that quiet moment, David understood, sometimes, family is not only what you are born into, it is what you choose to protect, nurture, and hold close to your heart. The night settled over the city, but inside David, Maria, and Daniel, a new dawn had begun.